Welcome back, you guys. We are now about halfway through the semester as we get closer and closer to our midterm or exam one. This is among the last topics included in that pool for that test. And we are now on to lecture 6, types of sedimentary structures. Sedimentary structures are also referred to as primary structures, and this refers to any organization of sediments or structures, otherwise imprints left behind during the depositional process in the formation of a sedimentary rock. So, without further ado, the first step in understanding sedimentary structures is in understanding sedimentary deposits. So, you guys have heard me refer to layers or bedding or bedrock layers, and bedding is any series of visible layers within a rock. Anything that we can visibly see is a differentiation from one type of rock to another, even if it's the same rock, it's just that in one part it has fossils and the other part it doesn't, or in one part it has striations or linear features, laminations, and in one part it doesn't. It can be any distinguishing factor, and this will vary between different geologists. If I were to look at one outcrop, I might count up, okay, there's 23 different beds here, and another geologist might look at it and say, I'm looking at a little bit closer in detail. I'm thinking there's about 45. There can be a really wide range, and it just depends on how you distinguish between these. But the kinds that you guys will be looking at will be things moving from very distinguishable types of rocks. So most all sedimentary rocks or sediment is first deposited as a horizontal layer, given that we have the assumption that the land it's deposited on, the pre-existing rock below it, is flat, so that only makes sense that it would be deposited horizontally. This is an idea in geology or a law in geology referred to as the principle of original horizontality, meaning it was once or originally horizontal. If I were to look at these beds in this picture and they were all shifted vertically, the assumption would be that they were originally horizontal when they were deposited and that some sort of force moved them and turned the entire body to be vertically oriented. And with this assumption that they're deposited horizontally, this tells us that the oldest layers are usually on the bottom, with the succession of layers going upward being younger and younger. That's the principle of superposition. So what is superimposed or has the superior position is the younger body, meaning that you have to have, say, this sandstone here. We have to have that sandstone there in order to have this mudstone on top of it. This mudstone would be younger than this sandstone because it comes after that sandstone in time. If it were below, then it would be older. But this mudstone would be older than this sandstone, and this mudstone would be younger than this sandstone. So it's all relative to what layer you're talking about. But from the oldest will be deepest, and the youngest will be most shallow. Make sense? All right, so we touched on graded bedding a little bit in the weathering and erosion lectures. And so this is really a function of sediment being suspended in liquid, or this can happen in wind as well, although to a lesser degree. And that when there's a change in energy going from higher energy to lower energy, eventually all of that suspended sediment will settle out, with the heaviest and largest sediments sinking out first, and then the lightest and smallest sediments being suspended the longest. But eventually, given a low enough level of energy, it will all settle out. But because they're settling out at different rates, heavier things settling first, we end up with this gradation or graded bedding. The largest at the bottom, medium, smaller and smaller, fining upwards. And this type of deposit is commonly associated with turbidity currents. This is much like rolling debris at a rock falling or a cliff collapse, or if perhaps you've ever seen a building be demolished, you'll see a wave or cloud of these rolling circulations of debris moving further out and getting larger and expanding as they go, and eventually it loses energy from that initial collision or demolition, explosion, whatever the trigger was, and then it'll settle out and slow down, of course, with the heaviest pieces falling first, and then the lightest and particles still being suspended in the air. So this can happen in continental shelves or in some terrestrial settings as well, wherever we go from a higher energy to relatively quickly shifting to a lower energy. So all of those debris will begin to roll into circular currents down some sort of slope. Remember that it's going to flow from high energy to low energy. Water will always move from high to low, purely as a function of gravity. And as this happens, they'll roll over themselves down the slope, and we end up with this graded bedding that finds upward. This finding upward, furthermore, is an indication of what direction is up. And that may be easy to see in a figure like this. Well, the heavier things settle out, so yes, the finer things are at the top. But that may be a little bit more difficult to see when we have a repeated pattern of this happening in a particular environment, which creates a deposition where this pattern is stacked. But the trick here is really to look at where you have that gradation. So you'll see a gentle gradation from large to small. It's getting finer and finer as we move upward vertically, and then a rather abrupt change back to coarse. It would be much harder to tell where up was if it went gradationally from coarse to fine and then back to coarse. But you'll be able to tell which direction up was because you'll see an abrupt change from the fine to the coarse. There won't be a gradation from fine to coarse. There will only be a gradation from coarse to fine because of the way that those grain sizes settle out of suspension. And these lines here simply represent the finest of fine grains. So when we see a bunch of these little horizontal dashes, this is showing us that there's a mud deposit of some kind, which would make sense for this depositional environment. This is just a continuation of that same gradation. So we go from coarse gravels to medium sands to fine sands, these little dots, to muds, silts, clays. Same thing repeated again here. In this cycle, we didn't quite get to the muds by the time another turbidity current came, but this is all part of interpreting the history of this deposition. So this could be part of a drill core that we're looking at, for instance. Couple of examples of where you can see this in real life. Here are a couple sand to mudstones where you can see the coarser grain sand literally grading and fining upward all the way until you can barely make out or not at all make out the grains individually to where it gets to a mudstone, which is why we have those little horizontal dashes, because we usually see these horizontal features once we get to fine enough muds. Those are called laminations. Here, same idea, don't quite get to the muds, maybe a little bit up here, but mostly we're going from these gravels, pebbles, up to the finer sands, which means when this rock was deposited, this was the up for both of them. Hence why graded bedding serves as one type of up indicators in geology. There are several of these. Graded bedding is one of the clearest because of the way that those grains settle out. So imagine that you were given a rock that was just this portion of it, and depending on how someone hands it over to you, it may not be oriented correctly. And if I were to ask you, well, which way was up? Was it side A, B, C, or D? The way to tell that would be the direction of the graded bedding, and you would be able to tell me side A. One other good up indicator that we can look for in sedimentary rocks, and is also a sedimentary structure, are ripple marks. These are small ridges formed on the surface of sediment by moving wind or water. You've seen these ripple marks when you go to the Lake Michigan shore and you look at your feet after a certain windy day. You'll see little lineations in the sand that kind of move up and down and resemble the patterns of the waves. This is an example of what those ripple marks can look like when they are preserved. And so it's pretty much exactly what you would see in real time when you're looking down at your feet, except it's been solidified into a solid rock. There are two kinds of ripple marks. One is symmetrical and the other is asymmetrical. So for the symmetrical, that means that we can cut it and it will be the same over a mirrored plane. So if I cut at the peak of any of these and then fold it over itself, it's a mirrored image over any which one of them. This peak is pointing straight up, and that's because we have a bilateral wave motion. The waves come into the shore and then they retreat back, and then they come into the shore and they retreat back, and then you have a lovely recording for your white noise machine. But this is what produces those symmetrical ripple marks. So that's one way that we can look at some rock like this and say, we know that this came from a near shore marine environment because we see these symmetrical ripple marks. And it's hard to tell when you're looking at it from a bird's eye view like this, but if we were to take this rock and turn it sideways so that we could really see these peaks, we would be able to see that a lot better. And then we have asymmetrical ripple marks. This can also be a function of water, but this can additionally be a function of wind as well, but it is not a function of wave action because those waves move back and forth, giving us a nice symmetrical peaking of those ripple currents. But if we have a current, whether it be wind or water, primarily moving in one direction, we will see that all of the ripple marks point just slightly in that direction. So one example of what can produce this would be tidal flats. Those flood and then lower depending on where the water level is. And then that's something else that you can see in real time as well. And then if we have it preserved, say in this example of the sandstone, you can see that these are all gently, ever so slightly pointing towards the bottom right corner of the screen here. And that's because these are asymmetrical ripples, and these were formed by a singular direction current. And you may also see these structures on the surface of sand dunes as well. Not so much the sand dunes in Michigan, but you can see these in images of sand dunes in places with major deserts, where winds are a little bit stronger and a little bit more consistent as well. We covered cross-bedding in the last lecture as well. Remember that this can be something that happens as a function of both wind and water as well. We often see these structures with varying slopes within a single sequence or progression of bedding. Back to the horizontal bedding discussion, many geologists would count this as one type or one singular bed because it's entirely sandstone, and others may section it off by the changes in the angle of the slopes. So this is one part where you can clearly see a distinct change in slope. This even might be an erosional surface here, where part of it was cut off or eroded away, and then this was deposited on top of it. Here's a slightly gentler change in slope, and those are the more common changes. Here you can see a complete directional change in the slope, which is less frequent than just a change in the slope itself, but either way, they're indicative of both the strength of the current and the direction of the current. Steeper slope means a stronger current, and the direction of the slope indicates the direction that it was flowing in. And the latter of those two can sometimes be a bit counterintuitive. For example, with these, it may be hard to tell, well, relative to how this is oriented now, was the current flowing to the left or to the right originally? And in this, the case would be that it was flowing to the left because it would have had to come up to a peak. It would be blown this way, come up to a peak, build right in that peak, and then it would fall and slope down in this direction. So this would be coming from the left for these particular planes right in here, those gentle slopes. So it's really all about the slip face, or the side that it rolls down on. That's how you're going to end up getting those lineations or those slopes. And note also that cross-bedding as a result of wind-blown sand will almost always have a gentler slope than that of its water counterpart, and that's because wind generally will move less sediment than water. Water can carry more energy for longer periods of time. There's those desert dunes that I talked about earlier where you can see those faint ripple marks on the surface of that dune, but also if we were to take a slice out of this and look at the cross section, what we would see is a series of evolving cross beds, indicating the direction and the strength of the wind that has built them over time. Same thing with our coastal dunes that we're a little bit more familiar with in Michigan, just less common for us to see ripple marks on the surface of those. And it can sometimes be difficult to distinguish between cross-bedding from wind and cross-bedding from water in a deposit or a rock face outcrop like in this image here. The key differences, however, that you're looking for are number one, going to be the frequency and change of direction. Wind deposits are much more susceptible to full changes in direction because it's less predictable and the wind direction can change. Whereas with water-based deposits or water current, especially if it's an asymmetrical ripple, you're not going to have a change in that current because if it's a flowing river, that river is going to flow from high to low. That current's not going to change direction. The river won't suddenly start flowing uphill. Now that really only applies if you're looking at the asymmetrical ripple currents, if you have the ripple currents to back up your cross bedding. On the other hand, if you have several successions, meaning several differentiable layers, mainly indicated by the changes in slope. If you have several of those that you could look at and they're all pointing in one direction as far as the direction of the current that deposited these, it's fair to assume that this had an asymmetrical current or asymmetrical ripple marks at the top if it did. Other things to look for too. Number one, if it's wind-based, generally we're going to be looking at finer grains, probably more well sorted as well. And again, that's because wind is less likely to move heavier grains than water can. And the other part is because of that same mechanism, just less energy, generally speaking, in wind environments, we'll also be looking at thinner beds. They're more likely to collapse, and because they can't hold up that buildup right at the edge before it falls down that slip face. Alright, so we also talked about mud cracks in the last lecture, how those form, how that breaks down rocks, how that participates in the weathering and erosion processes. As a quick reminder, anytime that you're seeing a preservation of these mud cracks in a sample, you know that this had to come from an environment where there was cycling of hydration and dehydration. So that would be an environment like a tidal flat where you have a rise and fall of the sea level, lake bottom, so depending on the weather conditions, it'll be very dry for a long period and then very wet for a short period and then very dry, so on and so forth. Flood deposited sediments, so any area that's subjected to periodic or cyclical flooding, but with those longer dry periods in between, or desert floors. This can also happen. They tend to look a little bit different, but this can also happen in desert floors if there's a high enough mud content with enough and regular cyclical rainfall. And I have a couple pictures for these of what we're perhaps more used to seeing, so this would be something that we could see in real time again if we went out to a desert or a tidal flat under dry conditions. We would probably see these mud cracks just like this and in the fragile condition that they're in. These can also be preserved in rocks over time through cementation and compaction. And because of that, they can appear in one of two ways. Either number one, what we were just looking at in real time, but with the cracks later filled in with sediment, or number two, the imprint. So this would be an example of a cast. So all the sediment that's filled in these cracks and was overlying this, if we then separated those out later, we would peel away the piece, the mold, and then the cast. So what filled in those spaces and what made those spaces. And so this then becomes yet another up indicator. This one would be indicating the upward face because it filled in those cracks. So we would know, looking at the opposite half of this, that that was the lower face, and that this one with the molding is the upper face. Mud cracks, cross bedding, and graded bedding are all among the most common sedimentary structures that we'll see, and are the best up indicators that one can look for. All of which, by the way, are structures that you are fairly likely to see in Michigan rock deposits, because Michigan once was under an ancient ocean. Michigan actually used to be a tropical like area some millions of years ago, which is why we have a bunch of limestone. Limestone comes from marine deposits. We have a bunch of sandstone as our bedrock. Those are those marine tropical type deposits where we can see a bunch of fossils, like the Petoskey stone. And fossils are also a type of sedimentary structure or primary structure. It's among everyone's favorites. And mind you, fossils can either be the direct remains that have been preserved over time, or the impressions of remains. So we can then split fossils into several different categories, starting with body fossils. These are unaltered remains, meaning that they have been so well preserved that they have not been chemically altered or structurally altered over time. This can only happen by a few different mechanisms, and it's very or relatively rare to find. This either happens by freezing, mummification, it can happen in amber, which is a fossilized tree resin, or in tar. You guys have probably seen Jurassic Park. This is what that concept is based on, that they were able to draw blood and get a DNA sample from a mosquito that was preserved as an unaltered body fossil within a piece of amber. This would not work out because DNA in blood, once ingested by an insect, deteriorates relatively quickly and so would not be retrievable. However, from amber, we have been able to retrieve intact DNA from some insects. So not anything that was in their stomach, but in their bodies, in their DNA. We have been able to extract only those that have been preserved under what would be considered ideal conditions. So amber is amongst one of the better options. Tar, not so much. Freezing and mummification, sometimes that process with heat or cold can be destructive to the DNA as well. So amber is usually our best bet. Still, that doesn't always work out, but we can read in some DNA data from that. As far as body fossils go, as a product of freezing, most of the samples that we have of this are from around the last ice age. So take, for instance, this baby mammoth. It's about 40,000 years old. It was found in 1971 in Siberia. And this freezing process, while we only have so many samples and it's from mainly the last ice age, are preserved fairly well, as you can see exemplified by the hair still present on this mammoth 40,000 years later. By far the most common body fossils that we find are those of cephalopods, so squid-like, snail-like creatures. Their shells, their hard body parts left behind. These creatures are the ancestors of modern squids, and they're kind of like a combination of squids and snails. Their circular shells are called ammonites. Those are the types of fossils that we might see. And these are actually filled with individual chambers. So the lines that you see on these shells are individual air chambers that they can fill with differentiating layers or amounts of air in order to adjust their buoyancy. Scuba divers wear what's called a BCD. That's their vest that hooks up to their scuba tank. BCD stands for Buoyancy Control Device, and these are sort of like a natural BCD. They can inflate it or deflate it to adjust their buoyancy as needed, or they could, because these have long been extinct. So if we can find unaltered remains, that means we must also be able to find altered remains. So petrified wood is one example of an altered remain. When trees are covered with enough mud and ash, they can be deprived of oxygen. This is something that commonly happens in volcanic mud flows or lahars, so that would be a massive amount of volcanic ash and mud moving across the land and ripping up trees and burying them in several feet of that material. This means that they have less access to the atmosphere and less access to oxygen. And oxygen is actually the primary agent of organic decay. Ironically, we need oxygen to be able to breathe, but it's also what causes us to age. That's why vacuum sealing your beef jerky or your steak or whatever it is helps to preserve it longer, because it's not as exposed to the atmosphere and specifically exposed to oxygen. Now this is just a decreased level of exposure to oxygen, because there's still going to be water in that mud that buries it, and so it does have some access to oxygen, which means that it can oxidize, partially giving it a nice range of different hues of different colors, which is why a lot of people seek out petrified wood, such as some of these examples from the Painted Desert in Arizona. We can have purples, reds, blues. It all kind of depends on the level of oxygen exposure and how deep into the tree it was able to penetrate. And so that's what gives us petrified wood. And this would be an example of a heavily altered fossil. And while petrified wood isn't so much structurally altered in this process, it is completely compositionally altered from that base organic material, the tree itself, wood, into chert or microcrystalline quartz. That's why it's so hard, because quartz has the high hardness of 7, but it also has a shiny, sparkly property to it. Another reason why people seek it out as a decorative piece. Another option for altered remains is the carbon imprint or film left when anything that is carbon based is squished or smashed. That decay or leftover organic material can leave an imprint on a rock. So one example of that would be this palm leaf on the left hand side, and another one is on the right hand side of a bug. I think it might be a mosquito, I'm not sure, but left behind from that organic material. So it's like a carbon smudge, and this would be an altered remain because the structure doesn't remain, neither does any of the other lipids or proteins, amino acids, just the carbon left behind from that living organism. Circling back to molds and casts like that of the mud cracks that we looked at earlier, molds are what makes the shapes or pushes the space, and casts are what fills in the cavities or voids within that mold. So those are two pieces that we get from one structure, and those are both fossils that are left behind, or preliminary structures, sedimentary structures, all saying the same thing. It's just that the sedimentary structures encompasses the fossils, the molds, and the casts. So for an example on how we can get a mold and a cast, it's not necessarily mud cracks. This can happen with really anything that can push space or takes up space in the first place. So example here being the burial of the shell. So number one, the shell itself is buried. So it lands in the sand. The living organism that used the shell is done with it. It's been left behind. Over time, more sand accumulates over it. This continues to build up. Eventually, that sand turns into sandstone with that shell cemented in there. However, the shell will decay over time while the sand, the quartz-based sand surrounding it will not. But because that sand is turned into rock and that shell is decayed away, that means that we are left them with an empty void or a cavity. Eventually, that void will, once the rock is moved, will be filled in by some other sediment. Could be more sand, could be mud, just depends on what the new depositional environment is. And so if we then later were to dig this up and pull this out, we would find that we would be able to separate this into two different pieces. Number one, the mold, which would look much like the shell, and then the cast, which would just be that empty hole made by the burial of the shell in the first place. You've probably heard the saying, leave no trace. Well, trace fossils are where traces were indeed left behind. So these are anything that comes from the activity of a once living organism. So this can be a footprint or a burrow, or one of my favorite examples, droppings. So we can find fossilized feces from a number of different animals. It's really common to find fossilized shark feces relative to any other type of fossilized feces. And these are called coprolites. Some people fondly call them crapolites, so it's one way to remember them, but it is called a coprolite. And here's one image of it. It looks like a normal boring rock, but it is indeed a fossilized feces from a carnivorous animal, probably a shark. And if we were to chemically examine this, we would find small fragments of fish bones and other things that that shark would have eaten. Again, footprints are another example of trace fossils because it's a trace that was left behind. So this is one that people really like. There's a whole park in Colorado called Dinosaur Ridge, where they just have a bunch of mud flats that dinosaurs once walked across, and there are a ton of trace fossils left behind by them walking across the mud. Burrows are yet another trace fossil. These are the living tunnels left behind by various critters. These are usually something that we see made in marine type deposits of muddy sandstones, where snail-like critters have dug their way into the sand to create their home or travel pathways. So we will usually see these in a sandier sediment, later filled by a finer mud-like sediment in the form of vertically oriented, straight, parallel lines, such as in this example on the left. And that's because they've been broken up and somewhat preserved over time, but mainly filled in with those muds. So it can be hard to tell which way is up with these, as these are not a very good up indicator, because if you were to turn this rock and look at it, you may interpret this as mudded bedding instead of burrows. But one way to tell the difference between them is to flip it over on the other side, and if on one side it looks like speckled spots, like in this block on the right hand side where you see from one view these tunnels are banding if you're looking at it two-dimensionally, but you flip it to the top and you see two-dimensionally just a bunch of dots, that's a good indication that those are indeed burrows rather than layers. If they were layers, you would see them all across the sides of that block. And for those of you that have a natural interest in fossils and like to go to the beach in Michigan, I want to include some of the fossils that you may be able to find here on the shores of Lake Michigan. Number one are crinoids. So crinoids were a type of plant that has since been long extinct, but were common in the tropical environments that Michigan once was. If these are buried and preserved, a lot of times the fragile crown of the marine flower will have disintegrated and fall apart, but what is more sturdy is the stalk of the plant. And so you can easily and commonly find on any given day on Michigan shoreline these crinoids, more specifically the part of their stem which is broken into columnar pieces, sort of like the vertebrae in our spines, where you'll just get these little discs that look like almost like tiny donuts, or washers sprinkled throughout a rock because the stem has fallen apart, but those building blocks of it were strong enough to remain. So next time you're at the beach, you can look for those and be able to identify them as crinoids. Again, they look like little washers, and if you were to stack them all up, they would form into the stem of what was once this crinoid ocean flower of sorts. Stromatolites, not nearly as common in Michigan, but you can find them on the flip side of the lake in Wisconsin. Stromatolites are these beds built up of bacteria in these sort of wispy or circular beds, where you can see these lines, like in this picture here, of concentric layering, and these are from bacteria building up layer after layer. The left-hand image here is, again, a real-time sort of example of stromatolites being built, but these are really cool. A lot of people seek them out. These structures are actually among some of the oldest fossils in the world, and they're indicative of early life conditions because the cyanobacteria that build these are in need of A, shallow, clear waters, B, shallow oxygen, so periodic exposure to the atmosphere. So these form commonly in areas like tidal flats, where the sea level is rising and falling by a few feet or so throughout the day. Another fossil that you can sometimes find in Michigan is that of a brachiopod or a bivalve. They're both types of clams that were really common in the Devonian time period, as you saw in your geologic time video. And I like to think of these, at least the brachiopods, as butterfly rocks. So this is the brachiopod on the left-hand side, and this is the bivalve on the right-hand side. Bi meaning two, and valve meaning faces. So it's two faces on a singular hinge is the bivalve. This is a regular-looking clamshell. You can see a lot of different species of this still to this day. With the brachiopods, they have one line of symmetry along their hinge if you cut them this direction, but they're different from the bivalves in that if you cut them in the opposite direction, they will not have that same plane of symmetry. So that's the difference between those two, and you can find both of these fossilized and preserved also on the beaches of Michigan. Horn coral is another common one. Horn coral and crinoids are probably the two most likely for you to find. Just putzing around at the shoreline on Lake Michigan, out in South Haven or Van Buren, not too far from us at Kalamazoo Valley. Horn coral is an example of that. It kind of reminds me of those corn chips. I think, what are they called? Oh, Fritos Bugles. I had to look it up. Or cornucopias, Thanksgiving time. A lot of times what you'll see these as when you do find them on the shoreline is you'll just see a chunk of it. It's probably broken over time. If you find a whole one like what's in this picture, that's a pretty rare success. But what you can see is just the cross section of this. So you can see these natural breakages, and that's just the growth portion. So it usually breaks along those lines, so you end up with just a slice of this. But you can still see this sort of lineation pointing towards the center, this radial kind of pattern to it. On the other hand, you can find, this is a type of coral, by the way, this horn coral. And on the other hand, you can find bryozoans. Those are ancient types of sponges, put into simpler terms. And then that's where you can see not so much the inside like this picture, but if you find it, it's going to be this texture of the gathered circles or hexagonally shaped polygons next to one another. The Petoskey stone is a coral, though, so sometimes it can be hard to tell the difference between a bryozoan and a coral. And if it comes down to it, if it's not identifiable specifically as one species or another, the way to tell the difference is going to be in the inner portions. so this inner webbing here, which is why this side is cut off and cut away. But oftentimes you don't have that whole thing preserved, so sometimes you just can't tell the difference. So with a little bit of fun and something to hunt for on your next trip to Lake Michigan, I'm going to circle back to that very first concept that we talked about here, and that's that principle of superposition and original horizontality. These are part of what we call Stennas Laws. Stenna was a initial geologist who set a lot of the principles that we still carry today in terms of relative dating. And relative dating is simply dating a particular bed of rock relative to another bed, and with the assumptions that everything was deposited horizontally and the principle of superposition, you can say this bed relative to this bed is younger or older. So for example, this blue bed here would be relative to this yellow-orange bed, younger. Now there are a few other principles to understand within this idea. Number one is the principle of uniformitarianism. Simple terms, this means that we are making all of these conclusions based on the assumption that whatever processes are happening today, what we can see in real time, are exactly the way that it happened X thousands of years ago, X millions of years ago, even X billions of years ago, in some cases. So the same thing that produces mud cracks today, the assumption that that's the same thing that produced mud cracks 300,000 years ago, for instance. Principle of superposition, you know. And then there's a principle of lateral continuity. This means that the beds will continue laterally. This ties in with the principle of original horizontality. These are used interchangeably at times, meaning that they're deposited horizontally and continuous in that lateral horizontal direction. Next is the principle of cross-cutting relationships. This simply means, and this is usually referring to igneous intrusions, those dikes and sills that we talked about, that whatever's cutting through the bedrock has to be younger than the bedrock itself. Can't cut through that bedrock if it's not there in the first place. So here in this image we have the example of a dike intrusion, and all of this rock behind it that you see must be older than it because it can't cut through that rock, can't be there if it's not younger than the older bedrock. If there's nothing to cut through, it can't cut through it. However, you see that this dike discontinues at the end of this yellow mud or sand layer here, and that indicates to us that it continued past this at some point, but this surface was eroded away before this blue entirely mud layer was deposited on top of it. So there's a couple ways to read into this, and we can know that because that dike is there in the first place, this dike intrusion has to have occurred before this erosion took place to be able to cut it off. That erosion couldn't have cut off the top part of that dike if there was no dike there to cut. Lastly is principle of inclusions, meaning that if there is some kind of rock included in a particular rock that you're looking at, that means that that included piece must have been created or made first in order to be included in the first place. To better explain this with an example, let's go back to that dike. Let's say that this dike is a basalt. However, if we were to drill through it and sample it, we might find chunks of granite in it. Notice that there is a granite batholith that dike cut through. It's possible that as that dike intruded and it was still molten lava and it broke through that granite, it perhaps picked up little chunks and pieces of that granite, and then that became solidified into that basalt and is included in that basalt. But that granite had to have been there first. That granite intrusion, that granite batholith, must have intruded that bedrock before that dike came through in order to be included in that dike. These principles are the foundation of relative dating, and relative dating is the main way that geologists date rocks. We can also use fossils that we find in younger beds to be able to determine the age. And we can use other methods like carbon dating and radioactive dating as well. But because we can see something like this in a cross section or a road outcrop, it's most accessible and it's cheapest to do, so it's the most common way that we date rocks. Unless we need something more specific, we're not going to collect a sample and send it to a lab for testing. Fossils in some cases are something that it would be cheap and easy as well. If you just see it in the outcrop, you can take a picture and look it up and say, oh, so we know that this fossil lived from X year to X year, and so this rock must be within this range of ages old. Most fossils that we look at, that's related to living organisms that happened after the Cambrian explosion covered in the YouTube video that you guys watched. This was a large diversification of species on Earth happening about 540 million-ish years ago. And so the important thing about these fossils and these occurrence of these fossils is that, number one, we can correlate beds at vastly separated areas of the Earth and say, okay, so we know that this continent was once much closer to this continent. That relates into the whole Pangea thing and the motion of plate tectonics and continents. That's a whole other thing that we'll get into next week. But also when mass extinctions have occurred. So taking a look at this graph here, we can see the global diversity mapped out as evidenced by the occurrence of fossils in different rock beds throughout the entire world. So this is a very large compilation of data. So from the origin or start of life, you can see that the diversity or the amount of species continues to climb until we hit a rapid drop close to the bottom there. And that marks an extinction. So you can see that through time towards 370 million years ago, increasing, mass extinction, increasing, mass extinction, 240 million years ago, so on and so forth. You can see all these rapid drops. So up to the current day, we can see recorded in the rock record by the presence of these fossils that there have been at least 5 mass extinctions. You can see a pretty significant drop here. It's not quite to the distinction of a mass extinction, but some scientists will argue that we have had 6 mass extinctions. So all of these are based on a 50% or more decrease in speciation. So some event related to radiation or climate have decreased the diversity in species globally by at least 50%. Some of the more major ones up to 90-some%, destroying 90-some% of life on Earth. The Great Dying occurred during the Permian period, and this killed off about 96% of all life on Earth. This was due to an increase in the acidity of the oceans associated with a significant rise in temperature from a high amount of volcanic activity releasing sulfur and heavy metals into the environment and warming the Earth. Adjacent to what we experience today, some accredited institutions have argued that we have entered a 6th mass extinction event as a result of anthropogenic or human-caused climate effect. In the last 50 years, we have decreased our speciation diversity by a little over 60%, which statistically puts us on par with our historic mass extinctions. And we will dive deeper into that once we get into our climate change unit towards the end of the semester. And that's exactly why it's important for us as a society and you all as educated individuals to have at least a foundational understanding of the geologic time scale. That's why we have that included in this unit, because while this is a lot of jargon that I don't expect you to memorize, this is the geologic table that I've had to memorize as a professional geologist, a lot of words that don't really mean a whole lot to you and I wouldn't expect them to, But the idea is to understand just how old our Earth is. It's 4.6 billion years old, and to understand that we are merely a blip on that timeline. That 100 years really isn't that long of a period of time at all. If you were to plot the entire history of the Earth onto a 12-hour clock, the entire existence of the modern Homo sapien wouldn't appear until the very last second of the very last minute, 11:59:59. So let it be known that all of the processes that have built these sedimentary structures that we've talked about, and any of these other rocks with graded bedding or ripple marks, anything that we're looking at in this class is something that is built up in a very long period of time, usually on the order of thousands of years, depending on what we're talking about, much longer than that. And that anytime that you pick up a rock, there's a lot more to be gathered than just a nice looking paperweight or a crystal that makes you feel better, but rather an entire history dating back perhaps thousands of years that you now have enough knowledge to interpret some of. You can read it like a book almost. Alright, so I will leave you guys on that note. I'll stop being so poetic, but of course, as always, I have some reminders for you. If you haven't already done so, go back and watch the geologic timescale videos that I included. Take the lecture quiz. There's going to be questions on those timescale videos on that as well. And then if you haven't already done so, go ahead and finalize your Metamorphic Rocks lab. I think I have most everyone's already on that. And then complete the Sedimentary Structures exercise. You can see that assignment in the week 6 module. And then I'm posting the Exam 1 study guide this week, so make sure that you take a look at that. If you have any questions, go ahead and shoot me a message on Canvas or come into the open lab hours before your lab begins, and we can address any last questions you have before you take the exam. All right, I will see you guys next time.